Hello and welcome to the final week of the Loft's virtual wordplay. My name is Caitlin Bolin and I am the Individual Giving Director at the Loft. We're so glad you're here. We hope that during the challenges of COVID-19 that this little corner has been a place of respite and creative inspiration for you. As you may know, when we began planning Wordplay, our intention was to have 100 authors and 10,000 visitors celebrating books in downtown East Minneapolis. Well, with a quick and thoughtful pivot, we have loved the opportunity to engage with you at home, bringing you conversations with today's top authors on conversation topics across the spectrum. Because you have shown up for us, we've reached over 40,000 viewers across the country. We are so grateful to provide all of our wordplay sessions to you free of charge, and that is due in large part thanks to the forward-thinking generosity and leadership of our sponsors, and especially our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. We would not be here without them. And while their support has gotten us this far, we turn to you, our dear virtual audience members, to bring us to the finish line. This week, as Minnesota raises funds as part of hashtag GiveAtHomeMN, and as we celebrate hashtag Giving Tuesday Now across the U.S., we ask you to please consider including the Loft in your giving plans. Your gift of any size allows readers and writers to continue to receive support through classes, fellowships, events, challenging conversations, and more, all at the Loft. And your donation will automatically make you one of our fantastic members. We hope you will support us as we support the literary community. Thank you for all you do for the Loft, and enjoy Wordplay.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Loft Wordplay's YA Roundtable. My name is Savannah Brooks, and I work at the Loft Literary Center. Before we get started, I want to thank Wordplay's presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, for their steady support of Wordplay, even during its virtual form. I also want to mention that this presentation is in partnership with Ryan Reed's Orion Company project. If you want to support the Loft's programming, you can do so by clicking the support button at the bottom of this presentation, which is also where you can buy and pre-order any and all of these incredible books from our wonderful local bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. As a reminder, we'll be doing an audience Q&A at the end of this session, so if you have any questions for our authors, you can submit those at the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of the screen. And now, to introduce the incredible writers joining us today, author of The Queen's Assassin, Melissa de la Cruz, author of Hardwired, Len Vlahos, and author of Kent State, Deborah Wiles. Thank you all so much for joining us today. To get introduced to your work, I'll have you all read a bit from your books, then I'll be asking 2 questions to each of you specifically, and afterwards we'll open it up to a group discussion about writing, pandemic hobbies, and all things YA, which will be followed by audience questions. Melissa, why don't you get us started by giving a brief introduction to The Queen's Assassin and doing a quick reading.
So The Queen's Assassin is a YA fantasy novel that tells the story of 2 young people. One is Calvin Holt, who is the most dangerous, most, I guess, what do you call it? He's kind of like the best spy in the castle. and he's kind of like the Secret Service. So, and he inherited the job from his father, who was the king's assassin for him. Now they have a queen, so he's the queen's assassin, and a young lady named Shadow who wants to be an assassin and train with the guild. And they kind of discover that there's corruption at the heart of the kingdom, and somebody's trying to do something terrible, and there's magic and adventure and romance. And it's really fun, and it actually came to me in a dream, which is kind of funny, because I don't think I've had that ever happen before, where I dreamed about two characters and I wanted to tell a story because I found them so compelling. And I'm going to read from the prologue of the book, which is when Cal's dad kind of gets the job that he's bound to. The queen took his rough hands in hers, pressing her thumbs to his wrists to feel the beat of his blood coursing through his veins. The skin on the queen's wrist had already smoothed over, as if it had never been cut at all. Say the words after me, she ordered. I, Corden Holt, guardian of Renovia, devoted servant to the House of Delafiore, he repeated as she continued, hereby pledge my life and that of my heirs to this promise. Defend the crown and restore the sacred scrolls of Dea to their rightful purpose. Is this your vow? Queen Liliana asked. This is my vow, Holt said. Until it is done, she asked. He paused, then nodded. Until it is done. Holt felt slightly ill as the declaration left his lips, almost as if the words had been removed from him by an unseen hand rather than given freely. A punch in the chest almost, but before he could grasp it, it was gone. The queen released his hands and handed him the goblet. He accepted it, willing himself not to hesitate, and drank of her royal blood. And with that, he was bound, as was his son.
Yeah.
And that's the Queen's Assassin.
So you've set up this really wonderfully complex, like, socio-political world for this series. And you mentioned that the two main characters came to you in a dream, but what was the process of creating like this place?
It was really hard. And I told my husband, remind me when I say that I want to write a fantasy that I don't. Because, I did start with the characters and then I had to put them in this world. And then I put them in this world and then I had to create a whole history for the world and also a magic system. So it kind of came in stages. Where I knew, I loved epic fantasy, so I wanted to set it, and and I love fantasy maps where there's only always 2 countries. In my fantasy map, there's only 4 countries. That used to be 1 kingdom, and it was, and I knew something terrible had happened, and that he was the Queen's assassin. That came pretty early. So I knew something had happened to the kingdom that was like wrong, but what was it? And I think I kind of started just layering it in, and then as I kept revising and drafting, other things would happen, like, oh wait, there's a whole line of kings, and there was a horrible king, who became a demon. So I would say it was just a lot of, like, instead of peeling an onion, adding the layers of the onion. And it was really fun, and part of it was a little instinctive, where I would just see where it would lead. And somebody said the book kind of reminded them of like a Sleeping Beauty story. And I said, oh, and then I kind of looked at it and it's like, oh yeah, it kind of does. So I think there was a lot of like subconscious fairy tale work into it as well.
Yeah, I think the fairy tale comes through really well. Mm-hmm. And we'll want to talk more about the Queen's Assassin specifically a little bit later on, but since I have, you here and we all have your undivided attention, I also want to hear a little bit about what it was like with your previous works in those series, seeing them come to life on screen. I know you're speaking to us from beautiful LA, and could you talk just a little bit about what that process is like?
So I've had a lot of books of mine optioned for Hollywood, but nothing had been made until Witches of East End. And it was so interesting because right before Witches of East End, kind of got sold and made, I've been working on Blue Bloods forever. And we had gone through this entire journey of everybody saying, this is happening, and I worked on it. We're kind of getting all the way almost to the end of the finish line, but just maybe 5 steps before, and then everything kind of shut down and it didn't happen. So I was feeling maybe a little, not bitter, but just kind of shocked, because it was my first time at the rodeo, I guess. And I think now I realize, oh, of course, that's just the way it is. And I think 1 out of 200 things in Hollywood that are optioned actually get produced. So when Witches happened, I really didn't think it was going to happen because we had just gone through this with Blue Bloods. So I kind of kept a little bit, I wasn't as involved. I liked the producer and I would meet with them, but, it was a little too emotional to go through that process and then not get to the end. So I didn't really want to feel that heartbreak again. So they sent me the pilot script and I was floored. I said, oh my God, this is amazing. And I actually cried because it was so like my book. And then they said, we're going to go film the pilot. And I said, really? But we went to see it, and I think it's just surreal. It's kind of hard to describe. It's not what you think. It's not what you think it is in your head, because it is a job that people are doing. And I think that's what struck me most was, this is, somebody's real job. This is not this fantasy in my head. People are working and trying to make this happen. So I think that's when maybe some of the fantasy ended, and I saw just, a lot of people working really hard to try to make something that would then be broadcast. And I just felt like the fairy godmother, because, you're a little one step removed, from the final thing. It was definitely based on my book, and those were my characters and their names. But in a way, it's also, the showrunner's vision of the project. So, and I think I really liked it. I enjoyed it. It was fun to see. It wasn't quite 100% my vision, but it was, I thought it was a fun translation of it.
Well, thank you for sharing your reading with us and all of that information. Wonderful information. I think it's so many authors, it just seems like a dream come true to watch like their worlds and their characters show up in real life. And it's very cool that you've been able to be such a big part of that. So moving on to Len, would you be able to talk to us a little bit about your book and give us a reading from Hardwired?
Well, thanks, Savannah, and hey, Melissa and Deborah, and hi, everybody out there in Minnesota and further afield. Thanks for joining us. We actually can't see you, so we're just going on faith that you're there. I think what I'm gonna do, there's like a 1.5-page prologue. I'll read that and then kind of do the elevator pitch for the book, if that works okay for you. And the book is Hardwired. Okay. I stand at a precipice. If I don't tell my story now, I'll never have the chance. That may sound dramatic, but it's true. Most everyone who will read this has heard of me. I saw a statistic online that mine was the 7th most recognizable name on planet Earth, after only the President of the United States, the Pope, the Dalai Lama, 2 mostly talentless pop stars, and 1 very talented athlete. Celebrity is a funny thing. If people have heard of you, they think they know you. They make up their minds based on 1-sentence extracts they see scrolling across their screens. OJ was guilty. Trump stole the election. I'm a monster. Maybe all of those things are true. Maybe none of them are. And maybe, because those same people don't seem to have the patience to click past the headline, no one will ever read what I'm about to write, or not all of it anyway. But I have to try. The people who do read this will come with a wide variety of motives. Some will be gawkers, people stopping on the side of the road to watch a brush fire consuming a mountainside. There will be plenty in this tale at which you can gawk. Some will have a baser interest, wanting to read about the experiments performed on me by supposedly well-meaning scientists. They won't be disappointed either. But I'm not doing this for them. I'm writing for the few people who want to learn the truth. The media seems to think my story begins with a lawsuit I filed against Princeton University and my own father. Why not? It's a juicy story. 15-year-old boy sues father for freedom. But that was more akin to the moment of a rocket's booster separation, when my life was propelled into orbit in earnest. The moment of launch, the real beginning, happened months before in a coffee shop, where I was lying on the floor, unconscious, again. So Hardwired is the story of 15-year-old Quinn, who, when the book opens, he has passed out. He has a syndrome called vasovagal syncope, which my son in real life has, which certain kinds of stress cause your blood pressure to plummet and you pass out. With my son, it's anything medical. So if he sees a hypodermic needle, he will faint. And my character has this. And the stress was caused because his father actually died when he was 7 years old. On the first anniversary of his dad's death, when Quinn is 8, his mother reveals a video message his father left for him. And it's just a, hey, I love you, I miss you, I hope you're okay. And here's a life lesson. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then each subsequent year, there's another video on the anniversary of the dad's death. The dad had turned his death into a thing to remember so sadly, into almost a kind of celebration. Until now, when Quinn turns 15 and he encounters what he is told is the last message. And he has trouble dealing with this, so he goes to his therapist. His therapist goes home and says, watch them all again. And he does, and he starts to see weird anomalies in the messages, things he was sure weren't there before. And he passes out, and he wakes up, and his dead father is sitting on the foot of his bed. Yeah. We find out Quinn is not a boy at all. He's an artificial intelligence, and his father is the scientist heading the project at Princeton University and his entire life is a fiction that was designed to get him to emote and become self-aware, and he has. And the balance of the book is really Quinn's fight for personhood and what does it mean to be a person. So that, in a nutshell, is Hardwired.
Wow.
Wow. And thank you for sharing that reading. I was able to read all of your books before I started this, and they were all really incredible. One of the things that stood out to me about your book, Len, was that it's so heavily researched about artificial intelligence, but also just all sorts of statistics about humankind. And could you talk about that research process, especially keeping up with technology that's constantly changing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know how authors in writing in 1940 researched books, because we have at our fingertips, this is basically the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? I mean, this has got a lot of very suspect information. But it's my favorite book, by the way. That's my phone cover too. A lot of very suspect information, but all the information at your fingertips. So a lot of my research was online. I did do some reading on artificial intelligence. There's sort of a futurist named Ray Kurzweil who's done a lot of thinking about it, and his model for what he thought an artificial intelligent brain might look like formed the basis of where I came from. But the rest of it was really just as the characters took me down different roads, I would need a piece of information and I would dive in and read about it.
Nice. And your book is sort of this tech thriller. And so we have that pulling the plot along. It's very exciting. But another really heavy theme that you mentioned before is talking about really the ethics and the politics of life and what is life and what gets to be considered life. And so what inspired you to go so deeply into that vein?
So two things. One is I seem to have this thing for writing books where my protagonist has got to be completely isolated, right? So the first book I wrote and its sequel, The Scar Boys, and Scar Girl, the protagonist is a badly disfigured kid finding his way in the world through punk rock, right? He's alone. In the second book, it's a girl whose father is dying of a terminal brain tumor. I guess I like killing fathers for some reason. And her house is turned into a reality TV show where the world can watch the family react to the father dying on television, and she's trapped in the house and becomes completely alone. So I really wanted to write about what it would feel like maybe to be othered. I'm a white middle-aged guy, right? And there are a lot of stories out there about being othered that are not mine to tell. But this character sort of presented itself to me as sort of a surrogate for what does it mean to be a person, right? If you took the extreme example, here's a non-biological sentient life. Is that life as valuable as all the others? What is its status and what should its status be? And that's kind of where Quinn comes from.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. Moving on to Deborah, would you talk a little bit about your news book, Kent State, and read for us?
Kent State, here it is based on history and a true story. But I call it a novel in lineated prose. It's a conversation basically about what happened in 1970. I was 16 years old on May 4th, 1970, when the National Guard occupied the Kent State campus in Kent, Ohio, and fired 67 shots in 13 seconds and killed 4 students, wounded 9 more. All the students were protesting the Vietnam War, as many students were across the US in May 1970, because President Nixon had just announced the invasion of Cambodia and widened the war. And these students knew they were going and they wanted the war to end. So in doing my research for this, at first I thought I'd never write about it. It was so stunning. It was just so stunning. My dad was in the Air Force, so we were an Air Force family, and we were stationed in Charleston, South Carolina. And my dad flew for 2 years, from 68 to 70, C-141 Starlifters from Charleston to Vietnam with supplies, and back from Vietnam with bodies. And the year after that, we moved to the Philippines, which made me think about you, Melissa. We moved to the Philippines for my senior year of high school, and he was in charge of the tarmac and in charge of all the planes coming in and out. And so we had this firsthand look at, just from my dad's perspective, but we never talked about the war. We didn't talk about it. Somehow I knew we weren't supposed to talk about it, but in school on May 4th, the next day, really, because that's when the news had broken that evening. I mean, we watched television, it's all we could talk about. So when I researched Kent State and went there several times and sat in the archives as well, and just read so much oral history, so much documentation, so much newspaper clippings, photographs, position papers, advertisements, propaganda, and history about the time, I knew that we had so many voices that were telling this story that we needed to tell it in a conversation. So thinking about that time in 70 and about that time now that we're living through, that same conversation that goes on right now, I wrote the book as a conversation. So I'm going to read from the very first part of it. It's addressing the young reader, and there are 2 voices. So I'll try to, there are 6 voices altogether, but there are just 2 in this section. So, and they're both students. You've got students, townies, National Guardsmen, all telling this story, but we start out with just 2 students who have a little bit of a different viewpoint, because I found all these different viewpoints as I researched. So here's Kent State, the lament that begins the book. You are new here, and we don't want to scare you away, but we want you to know the truth. So we will start by telling you what is most important. They did not have to die. But they did die. They were sacrificial lambs, coldly, deliberately slaughtered. No, they weren't. It was a mistake, a tragic mistake. It was calculated, planned. They were lambs. It was a tragic mistake. You don't have the whole story, and you always think you do. I know what I saw. I know what they did. I know that those kids will never wear tat sleeves or gauges or listen to Motley Crue or watch Star Wars or read Harry Potter or talk on a cell phone or use a computer or play video games or realize the Vietnam War is over and their unwilling, unknowing, unplanned for sacrifice helped it come to an end. Yes, it's a tragedy. And now there are more wars, war after war after war. War is never over. It's over if we want it to be. War is never over. John Lennon said it was. War is over if you want it. It's in a song he and Yoko wrote in 1971, Too Late for Allison, Jeff, Sandy, and Bill to hear it. Are we going to argue again? Yes, we always argue when we speak of the killings. Let's try not to argue. Let's tell it the way we remember it, all of us, because look, we have someone new here, someone new to listen to us. I see that. Hail, young friend, you are a feast for heartsick eyes. I can tell you're about the same age that Allison was. Allison and her flowers are better than bullets. That's what she said to the National Guard soldiers the day before they killed her. I think our new friend looks like Bill. Bill was an Eagle Scout. Or Sandy. I loved Sandy. She was wearing a red sweater that day. Or maybe Jeffrey. Jeffrey went to Woodstock. And then on May 4th, 1970, less than a year later, he was shot through the mouth and killed instantly. I loved Jeffrey so much. I loved them all. I did too, of course. 9 were wounded, don't forget them. I can't forget them, or us. We were all wounded that day. Yes, we all bear the scars of that day. Our country bears the scars of that day. We are forever heartsick, so let's tell the story one more time for our new friend, and let's try not to argue. I can try not to argue as long as you don't invite the others. The others will come. They always come when we remember. I tell them they are part of the story, even when they disagree with me. I disagree with you. We won't be able to stop them from coming. The ones who think those 4 deaths were justified, the ones who think more kids should have been shot and killed. I hate them. There is no place for hate here, not anymore. I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you for sharing.
Welcome.
As just a personal aside, as someone who lived right by Kent State for a bit and went to Virginia Tech in 2010, and so was pretty heavily immersed in the aftermath of gun violence, your book was very, very touching to me, as I imagine it would be for any reader. And one of the things that resonated with me, and that I really sort of wish I had had when I was a teenager, is a book that specifically talked about politics and activism. And so can you talk a little bit about what it's like to approach those really heavy but important topics for a teenage audience specifically?
Yes. I've been doing it all along in some ways with the 60s trilogy that I wrote. And actually from my very first book, which was a picture book called Freedom Summer. And it all comes out of my own childhood and my own remembrances. I always say that I write out of my life and turn it into story. And so with the 60s trilogy, writing about all the joy and disturbance and wonderful and awful things of the 60s, it gave me a chance to look at Kent State in a different way. And I remember finishing Anthem. I was finishing book 3 of the trilogy is Anthem. It came out last year. And I remember finishing Anthem and saying to David Levithan, who's my editor at Scholastic, and I said, there's just no way I'm not going to be able to write about Kent State because, you know, for so long I thought it's too horrible. And then I started to really pay attention to the connection between Kent State and today, and the connection between Kent State and government overreach in the past. And I could see the long arc, and I could make a line directly from Kent State to what's happening in our country today and the way that we're so politically polarized today as well. And it just felt to me like this was the time. This was the time to say, not only here's what happened with Kent State, here's what happens when First Amendment rights are squashed, but also here's what we can do about it. Insert your name here is the theme, you know, it's the refrain that I start using. But the novel's addressed directly to young people because I want them to know that they can be the change they want to see. I hope that feels like it answered your question.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. The past repeats itself, right? I feel like it can be.
Yes.
Can be,
and we saw that. We saw that. We see that now. Yeah.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier that there are 6 voices in your book. And I was wondering, you know, about your process of writing a novel in verse, for one, but especially writing a novel in verse that has so many voices in so many parts of this conversation.
Well, I can show you how it looks on the page. This is how it looks. And you can see that the voices are not named and they aren't gendered, but they do have different fonts and they have different typefaces and different sizes to those fonts. And that's how I delineate the conversation. When I sat there and sifted through this mountain of material at Kent State, and when I walked where the students had fell and went to the remembrance and memorials, it just became so clear to me that there was more than one story. In fact, David helped me with that. We had both read Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders and loved it. And I loved the idea of those disembodied voices coming from somewhere to tell this story. And then David asked the question, what about collective memory? You know, you've got so much material, and a historical event depends on everyone's memory telling it. So it became a conversation that was delineated that way on the page, left side, right side, middle. And all those different voices needed to be heard. And they came directly from research. I remember so clearly standing up when I picked up a letter that had been sent to the editor of the local paper in Kent, and it said, they should have killed more of them. And then I started sifting through the pile, and there were many letters like that. And then there were the Black United students, the bus students, they called themselves, who were fighting on campus for Black Studies programs, and who were walking out when the Oakland police came to recruit, because the Oakland police and the Black Panthers had such a problematic relationship, and that's a kind word. And the bus student oral histories were saying, you see a white man standing there in a uniform with a rifle and you don't think it's loaded? Get real. So that voice needed to be heard as well. So all voices are heard in Kent State. Students, Black students, white students, the townies who said you ruined our town, and the National Guard, who also had anonymous oral histories they gave saying we didn't want to be there, we were kids. And so many of us were actually even students at Kent State. And here we were standing in uniforms with bayonets and rifles and facing our fellow students. So there are a lot of stories to be told around that particular moment in time. And I wanted them all to be heard. So my hope is that when you read these, you will hear that conversation going on today differently, that all sides get to be heard. Because when we don't hear all sides and we squash First Amendment rights, people get fearful, people get angry, people get violent. So how do we make sure everyone's rights are upheld?
That was very lovely from all of you. And now we're going to open up this conversation to be a little bit more of a group discussion. And we'll step back from books a little bit, because the first thing that I'm really interested in, as someone who, has been home for about 8 weeks in a row now, right, is what new just interests and activities and hobbies you've picked up since you've been staying home, if you even have time.
Well, listen.
It's interesting because quarantine just feels like deadline life. And I think as writers, we're kind of used to being home. So my answer is my life really hasn't changed, except that there's no break. And when the quarantine hit, that was supposed to be my break, because I had just completed 3 deadlines and we were going to go on vacation for 2 weeks. And I was on tour with Marie Lou, and we were talking about how, we went on tour so that we could go on vacation after, because we were feeling like I don't want to speak for Marie. I felt like if I said I was too scared to go on tour, then how could I justify then getting on a plane and going on vacation a week later? So I said, I get to go on tour and then I get to go on vacation. And then I came home and there was no vacation. So it was a little hard to not have that, kind of mental and physical break from work. Because instead of going on vacation and getting a break, I just, now there's just new deadlines. So, and I'm just used to living at home and working from home. I am not leaving my house for several days, but after and it does feel kind of normal. And my husband's a writer too, that some days we forget that we're in quarantine, and he'll say, why don't we go out for dinner. And he's like, oh, right. We can't go out for dinner. So that's my answer. It's just the same, just no restaurants.
Go ahead, Deborah. You can.
All right. I've traveled for 18 years out on the road quite a bit, and schools, conferences, festivals, libraries, all kinds of things. And so it's different being home, although I had just this last year started to come home more and be able to write a little bit more, because writing on the road is really hard for me. And I had quite a domestic life before I started that 18 years on the road. So it's been lovely to get back into cooking and to get back into gardening and to get back into a routine that feels like I live here instead of I live here, but I'm always out there. And so that's been good. And to speak to what Melissa was talking about too, we were days before a national tour for Kent State when we called it quits. And I did go to Texas, to Mountains and Plains, and spend some time there, and flew home, and that was it. That was the big first part of March. And so it's been, it feels like you can't even talk about that in a way because of it's tragic what's happening right now. It's tragic, it's triage, it's weird, it's sad. And I guess I get to be sad too that we had this all set up and boom, we hit a concrete wall. But what I want to say about that is I've had some time to think on it and to live in it. And I'm so impressed with how Scholastic has just pivoted. I mean, they took them, everybody was numb for a few weeks and they went boom, and they just pivoted and so have you at Loft Literary, and so is everyone. Everyone's pivoting around. Booksellers or independent bookstores are amazing. And we're all pivoting to make this work in a different way. So sitting here talking to you like this is very different. But I'm really appreciative of that and of everyone's efforts, because we are still reading and stories do still matter. And it's important that we gather in it whatever way we can. So I get to meet all of you today, and that's a new thing for me and very, very lovely. I appreciate it.
That's a great segue, actually, because
Okay.
writing is one of my two jobs. My other job is my wife and I own 4 independent bookstores in and around Denver called Tattered Cover. And
Yes.
we pivot is a good word, right? We shut down our stores a week ahead of the stay-at-home orders here in Colorado.
Wow.
Out of concern for safety for staff and customers, and became overnight an online bookseller, which we're not. We're not set up to be. We're not meant to be. So I am working twice as hard to get our store a quarter of the revenue we would normally have, and
Right.
so I'm working 60 to 80 hours a week trying to get online orders out the door and think about the future and what does the future look like and how does it. And I should pause, by the way, Red Balloon Bookshop in Twin Cities is outstanding. So please do order our books from there. I've been there. It's a great bookshop. I spent many years of my career working for the American Booksellers Association, so I know America by its bookstores. The point is, and we have 2 kids. My wife and I have a 11 and 9-year-old, 6th and 4th grade sons. So my day is I get up in the morning, I either exercise or write from 5:30 to 6:30. Then I help the younger son do math, and then I go into the store to work on online orders, and I get home at 7:30 at night. And then I'm with the kids until they go to bed, and then it's crash time. I don't have a lot of time for hobbies, but we have an old 1971 Yamaha upright piano in our house. It was my parents'. I'm a guitar player I've been playing guitar for a long 40 plus years. And I'm a hack piano player. So I've been teaching myself songs on the piano just well enough to play and sing them for my own amusement. And I've learned about a dozen, and it's all since the pandemic. I've learned about a dozen songs that I can hack my way through. Not well, but enough to keep me entertained. And that has been my sanity moment. And the other one is my wife and I, late at night, we just finished rewatching the entire series, The West Wing. Because in the history of television, there's The West Wing and there's all other television. So that's that, Savannah, to answer your question, is piano and West Wing is what's kept me sane.
Love that.
I've never seen it. I think maybe I should start.
Oh, yeah, I loved it.
Binge it. It's great.
Yeah, highly bingeable.
I'll be honest, when you said old 1971 Yamaha, I thought you were going to talk about motorcycles, which is like one of my big hobbies. I have a motorcycle and I got very excited, but piano was also very cool.
Actually, Savannah, I used to own, I don't have it anymore, a 1973 Yamaha 450. I haven't had that for years, but that was my bike when I had a bike. So
there you go. I like it. Well, that talking a little bit about TV may segue into this or not. We've talked about dreams, characters coming to dreams, and we've talked about history. But for other of your books and just sort of in general, where do you all get these ideas, and what usually ends up coming first?
My first book, and I brought props, The Scar Boys.
I better go get my props.
Was it's a punk rock coming of age story, and when I was I had gone to NYU Film School. In high school, some friends and I had started a punk band. This is in the very early 1980s. And we reluctantly, when the band broke up when we graduated high school reluctantly, and two of us reluctantly went to college. But the draw and lure of music was too strong. The siren song of music was too strong. So we dropped out and got the band back together and went on the road. We put out our own 45 RPM single when the world was still only vinyl. We booked a tour coast to coast, including at the 7th Street entry, what's it called in Minneapolis? First Avenue, 7th Street. There's a big club there. And we were and across the country. We got 11 days into the gig and the van broke down and we got stranded in Georgia and we couldn't afford to get home. So we got fast food jobs and we wound up there for 4 months. And that experience was so weird and special that I wrote 100 pages of notes about it. And for years, tried to turn that into something. I tried writing, because I'd been in film school. I wrote 5 of the worst screenplays you will never read, essays, short stories. And eventually something clicked and I realized I kept trying to tell my story. It wasn't my story. It was a story about the power of music and its power to heal and give friends. So I discovered this character who I made isolated and made music really the hero of the book. So it came from my own personal experience. Everything I've written since has not been from personal experience, and it's all started with that what if. But the first one was and my dog wants me to play with her right now. My first one was very much drawn from personal experience. The backdrop of the books, even the characters are fictional, the backdrop is personal experience.
Segue for me just to say that that's everything I write comes from that. And I started out writing Mississippi stories because my parents were from Mississippi, and that's where all the relatives were. So that's where we went every summer as an Air Force family when we were there. Like we were 3 years in Hawaii, so we didn't make it home, but we brought my grandmother to us. And that was the beginning of Miss Eula Goes to Hawaii, which turned into Love Ruby Lavender. And then it turned into 4 novels about Mississippi summers and Freedom Summer. And I was there in Mississippi during all that 60s strife and civil rights unrest. And I didn't understand it as a kid. And I sometimes still don't understand it, but writing is a way toward understanding it. And that's what the 60s trilogy is about. When I sold that to Scholastic, I said, what I want to do is 3 novels of the 1960s for young readers that basically will follow my life through the 60s, but that will be highly novelized and also will include scrapbook material of primary source documents like photographs and song lyrics. And we did none of that in Kent State, but the 60s trilogy books are thick and they're full of these scrapbooks and they give you context for the time so that when, say in Revolution Book 2, you've got everybody, 1,000 souls coming south to register Black voters during an election year in Mississippi, the closed society. Well, the Beatles are also coming to America and Willie Mays is having a great year. So you're seeing this in context in the scrapbooks. And we ended up calling them documentary novels. We had never, I think we invented that. And so in 62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I lived in DC. My dad was the chief of safety at Andrews, so was Franny's dad. In Revolution, I was there in 1964. And in Anthem, I never drove a school bus across the country from Charleston to San Francisco like Molly and Norman do, but I did live in Charleston, which is where the story begins, and we followed them on their journey. So Kent State, of course, I've already talked about, is very similar in that it's something I lived and I wanted to know more about it. So a lot of my stories just start with questions. What was that all about? And how can I be as inclusive as possible and tell as many stories as possible? And you think that that Kent State in the 60s trilogy is about war, but underneath it all, it's really my bid for peace.
I think it's trying to think about, I'm going to talk about 3 of the books, and sometimes ideas are there for a long, long time, but there's no, but the execution of it, is not clear. So my book with Margaret Stoll, who's a really good friend of mine, called Jo and Laurie, is a romantic retelling of Little Women. And featuring Jo and Laurie.
Yeah.
And I had this idea to do something with Little Women maybe for the last 10 years. And my agent and I would keep talking about this idea, but we never quite got it right. I think I wrote several pages of an Amy focused retelling. And she's not my favorite character. So I was like, this is not really working. And then there was another, maybe Downton Abbey version of this novel that was very, upstairs, downstairs, which wasn't really working either. So I think there was like maybe one more idea, there was a modern retelling that also did not work. So we've been playing with this idea for a long time. And then I was talking to Margie about it. And she said, oh my God, I'm a 18th century literature scholar, and I love Little Women. And she said, well, what's the biggest problem with the book? I said that she doesn't marry Laurie. And she was like, that's our idea, but, can I write it with you? And I said, oh my God, of course. So that's where the idea came from, just, doing something with this book I loved. And then 10 years later, figuring out how to finally write it. And then another book that's coming out of mine this year is called Never After, which is a retelling of fairy tales. And that kind of took me by surprise, because I thought I was a little bit done with fairy tales after Descendants. And then I realized that I wasn't, that there were more fairy tales I wanted to tell that weren't based on Disney fairy tales. And I think that came from I did a little research, and I discovered that the story of Sleeping Beauty doesn't end with the prince waking her up. The original story has ogres and bloodshed and tragedy, and it's not at all a happy story. So I thought, oh, that's so fascinating. Maybe I can do something with that. So yeah, I think, I think my career looks a little bit like there are so many books that I'm working on all the time, but I don't work on them at the same time.
Right.
Some of them take years to work on, and that one of the books that came out this year was something that I'd been working on for 10 years and 2 years. So it just kind of like stays in your mind for a long time, and then finally it comes out.
Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions, but just really quick, a last question for you all from me is, what advice would you give to young aspiring writers?
I'd say read. And I feel like I'm a very self-taught writer. I did go back to school in my 40s, but I left early when I was 18 and got married, and but I knew that I loved stories, and I think a lot of the way I learned to write was just by reading. I think you inculcate an awful lot of what makes a story work, or how you characterize, or how you build a world, or how you use dialogue, just by reading, and then practice, and find someone to share it with. I guess I'd say that.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and not just because I own a bookstore. But the best book on writing I've read is actually Stephen King's On Writing. I'm not a huge Stephen King fan. I like some of his stuff, but it's a part memoir and part manifesto on being a writer. And he talks about, creating routine and places to write. And I agree with all of that, but read every day and write every day. If you want to be a writer, sit, even if it's for a half an hour, and you get some words on the page. They may be terrible, but read every day, write every day. And if you're working on something of a longer length, keep going forward. Don't look back, or you will fall into an endless, bottomless hole of editing. You can fix it in the mix, right? So I would say read every day, write every day, and push forward in your story. Keep pushing your story forward, because all good writing is rewriting anyway. So.
And my advice to young writers is always to not quit your day job.
Very good advice.
It's always a dream to write full time. So my advice is also to learn how to live. And the happiest day of my life was when I quit I had a day job for 9 years. I was a computer programmer at a large bank, and I was also a fashion editor. So I had these two kind of parallel careers, and I was a freelance writer. And I got laid off during the recession from the bank, and then I got laid off from the magazine after I left the bank, worked for a magazine, got laid off during the print recession. And instead of going back to work, I also learned how to live on maybe a quarter or a sixth of my old salary. So I would say, don't quit your day job, and kind of learn how to live on less, and kind of enjoy the writing. I had friends, it was the 90s, who were living in New York on, I would say, $8,000 a year, but they were full-time writers, and it was kind of amazing, and they loved it. I don't think that's a little low. But I do think there are some practical concerns, so don't forget about those.
Savannah, I need to add one thing that my publisher would kill me if I didn't. My book was supposed to publish April 28th. Because of the pandemic, it's pushed back to July 7th. So if you order it now, you are pre-ordering the book. And there is a whole pre-order campaign, but I would be remiss. The book's not out yet. It was supposed to be. Doesn't come out now until July. Okay, sorry.
Is yours out, Melissa, now?
Sorry?
Is yours out now?
Yes, mine came out in February.
Okay.
So,
And mine was April, I didn't even consider moving it, but it's tied to the May 4th anniversary. So,
By the way, Melissa and Marie Lou's event was one of the very last events we did at Tattered Cover.
Oh, and by the way, I go to Tattered Cover every time I go to Denver. And my son went to the University of Colorado in Denver, the one who now lives in LA, but he was there 4 years, and boy, we had a good time.
Folks, when people say that writing and publishing is a very small community, this is what they mean.
Yeah.
Well, I want to jump into some audience questions. And the first one we have is from Abby, who asks, is there a character you read growing up that you related to or wanted to be more like, and have they shaped your writing at all?
Nancy Drew and no.
Joe March and yes.
Yeah.
Gosh, the two books that stand out to me from high school were Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I can't say I wanted to be like Arthur Dent. But the other one was Inherit the Wind. And I sort of really fell in love with the whole argumentative debate nature of the Clarence Darrow character in that book. So maybe.
Short and sweet. I like it. One of our next questions for you all again is, could you discuss your paths to publication? If you got an agent, how you got a publisher, etc.
Yay. How long is this hour? Oh, wait.
Mine was non-traditional. I worked in the book industry, so I had friends in publishing, and I asked a friend to read my manuscript. It was an adult, The Scar Boys was an adult novel when it was first written, and he said, well, yeah, let me work on this with you. And we worked on it for 9 months together. He got me an agent. He took it to his editor, and they passed. So now the agent was stuck with me. We got rejected by every able-bodied fiction editor in New York. And then my wife said to me, you know, what you have here is actually a young adult novel. I said, I do? And she said, yes, you do. And I rewrote it, recast it as young adult. And then we got rejected by every able-bodied young adult editor until the last one. And they all said, we like the book, but it's a boy protagonist, it's set in the 80s. We can't sell that. So the last one said, I'm going to take this to my editorial meeting. And I said, I said to my agent, would it help if I got some indie bookseller blurbs? She said, so I called a bunch of indie bookseller friends. They read it in 2 nights. I got 4 blurbs that pushed them over the edge, and it got the book published.
Yay.
Great. That's a great story.
I wrote a novel when I was 22 and basically did the cold call. There was a book called The Writer's Market, and it listed agents and publishers, and it had instructions on how to query them. You know, because nobody knows how you get to be an author, but there was a book. So I read it, and I sent it to about 25 agents, and about 6 of them, oh, by the way, you're only supposed to send the first 3 chapters and a little synopsis. So I sent the first 3 chapters and synopsis to 25 agents. 6 of them said, we'd like to read the book. So then I wrote the book because I wasn't going to write it unless somebody wanted to read it. So I sent it to the 6, and 3 of them wanted to represent me. And I went with an agent who I think was, I guess, the most experienced, and he had sold Auntie Mame in the 1950s. Wow. And he was a great, great old guy. And he sent the novel to Simon & Schuster, and Jeff Klosky, who's now the head of Riverhead, was the young editor who liked it. But he said, you know, this isn't a novel. You're a good writer, but this isn't a novel. And I'm not buying it. I was like, what? And he said, you should really try to start your, try to get some pieces published, you know, in the newspaper and magazines. Nobody's going to publish a novel from somebody who hasn't even written professionally. So, you know, I was quite young. I just graduated from college, and I started writing for a bunch of free newspapers and magazines in New York. And as the years went on, I would get a new agent, and I think I was on my 6th agent when we went out with my 3rd novel, still unpublished, and she sold it in 2 weeks. So I always say it took 6 years and 2 weeks to get published. So it was quite, you know, and it was a little discouraging, and that it took so long. Because it felt, and right before we sold it, I really felt like, okay, if it doesn't happen, then I guess I'll just work at the bank and that's fine. But then it did. So, and then we hit the ground running.
That's great. I'm old enough to remember when there weren't lots of conferences, festivals, and opportunities to meet writers, editors, or art directors or agents. And when it was just a huge mystery as to how a book would get published and accepted or even sent somewhere. But I sat down when I was 25. I still remember sitting on the steps of the house I lived in at the time and writing what I called my manifesto, which I still have, that just says how much I want to be a writer, basically. And then I began going to the library. And so the public library helped me become a writer, because the writer's market was in there, but there was also LMP, Literary Marketplace, in the reference section. And it listed every single publishing house every year and everybody at it. And there were just a couple of conferences, like SCBWI did one, and I lived in the DC area at the time. And then the Children's Book Guild of DC, which I'm a member of now, also did a children's book festival. So I met some people that way. But mostly I just had to read and read and write and write. And I started out as a freelancer by doing that. And same thing that you were talking about, Melissa, is that I started out writing free articles for a free newspaper. And then I went into getting paid for a little bit to write. And I had to learn how to do that, though. I used to buy used textbooks from Wonder Book and Video and Frederick Merrill. And I used to read all of those essays that they would have you read and then ask questions, and I would answer them all, and I'd underline everything. And I still learn like that. I still, to this day, am a learner. And have so much to learn. And so one thing led to another, and I finally started sending work out. And for 10 years, it was rejected while I kept on freelancing. And then finally and I went back to community college. I took a couple of writing courses there. And finally, Liz Van Doren at Harcourt Books wrote me and said, I really like this. Do you want to work on it? And it was a picture book about a little girl and her grandmother in Mississippi. And that became Love Ruby Lavender, my first novel. And at the same time, I was writing about the pool closing in Mississippi in '64. And that became Freedom Summer for Ann Schwartz. But one thing after, I met some people online who were writers. They helped me open a door here and there. In 1996, I went to ALA, which was in New York City, and met the writers that I'm still in touch with every single day. There's 5 of us that get together, and there's not a day that passes we don't send an email or whatever it may be. But to have connections like that are just your community, that will read for you or will encourage you or will help with whatever, just listen to you and celebrate with you when things happen too. One thing leads to another, to another, to another. But it took a long time, and I still takes a long time. But it's possible. That's the point.
Well, I work as a literary agent, actually a young adult and kidlit literary agent. So I'm glad that you all mentioned that it takes a long time, because I feel like that's what I always really want people to remember, is that the process is not super fast.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions. And so this next one is for you, Deb. It says, before you read your excerpt, you said something like the students were protesting because they knew they were going to the war, I assume. That was a surprising summary of their reasons for protesting the war. How much does your book lean into the framing of the student protests?
That's a good question. And that was my fast answer, my quick answer, in order to give us all time. And when you read Kent State, you will see that there's a prelude that explains this in much better detail than what I did. But the war, there were students on Kent State who were pro-war, and the athletes especially, who were like, I'm going, but a lot of by 1969, there was a lot of dissent about the war. There was a growing feeling that the war was unwinnable. Walter Cronkite had told us that in 1968 on national television. And President Nixon had campaigned on a platform to end the war in 1968, and he won election. And now the war, even though the troops were drawing down, and that's something that President Johnson had put in place, now it was going to be widening because we were going to enter Cambodia. We had already, before Nixon told us that he was sending American troops across the border from Vietnam into Cambodia, saying that what he was going to do was root out Vietnamese strongholds of equipment and troops, so we could end the war faster, basically. I have links to this. If you go, I have a Pinterest page that has links to Kent State. I put all my research on Pinterest, so you can read more about it there as well. Debbie Wiles at Pinterest. But December of '69, the draft lottery began, the Vietnam War draft lottery. And then a lot of deferments went out the window. If you were in college, you usually could get a deferment so that you didn't have to go to Vietnam. You weren't 1A. But after the lottery, when some of those kids were down to like number 47 to go to the war, it was by your birthday, how they chose these little golf balls or ping pong balls that came out of the chute. Draft boards had to supply their quota of people to do this Cambodia work, and they knew that they were going to be included. They were going to go, they were going to lose their deferments, many of them. So they hit the streets partly to just protest this whole entire war effort, this unpopular, unwinnable war. And across the country, they called a national student strike. So it wasn't just in Kent State, it was many places. But at Kent State, the National Guard was called in, and those reasons are given in the book too. And when the National Guard was called in, they superseded all other law enforcement, and 4 days worth of building to this May 4th day is what caused the shootings. That's another quickie version, I'm sorry, but I think you should get the book and read all about it. I hope that answers some of it, though.
I would say so. Yeah, I think from reading the book, I think that gets like pretty in depth into how the story plays out.
It was complicated.
Well, unfortunately, we are at our hour. And so I'm going to go ahead and close us out. So thank you all again so much, Melissa, Len, and Deborah, for joining us and for reading from your books. Again, you can purchase any and all of their books, purchase and pre-order by clicking the button below. Another thank you to Wordplay's presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, and to our event partners, Ryan Companies, under their Ryan Reads project. And thank you all audience members for tuning in. We couldn't make Wordplay happen without your support.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for having us. Really lovely. Nice to meet you all. This is fun. Thank you.